And today, as you can see, we're going to begin discussing the 20th century. And specifically, we're starting with the First World War, also known as the Great War, which occurred between 1914 and 1918. Now, I have two pictures here. The one on the left is sort of a standard picture of the pre-war world, the Edwardian period. And on the right, we have a picture from the First World War, a dead soldier hung up on barbed wire. And one thing we're going to be considering today is how people kind of go so quickly from the picture on the left to the picture on the right in just a matter of a few years. Now, in the pre-war world, the 1900 to 1914 period, we have some really important technological developments that seem to indicate to people that things are going in a positive direction. We have the invention of the automobile. Now, technically, the automobile was invented in the late 19th century, but it's in the early 20th century that it becomes more and more visible, more and more affordable, especially with Henry Ford's manufacturing system. Now, cars like the one in the picture would have been something only the very wealthy could have afforded, but still, cars were more and more becoming part of the world people lived in. Cities were literally changing what they look like, how they were laid out because of cars. Cars fundamentally changed the way human beings traveled. Before this, you really had only a few options. You could walk, you could take the train, you could take a ship, or you could still take a horse and carriage. The car meant that you could travel much faster distances on your own time. You didn't have to wait around for the train. So this completely changes how people travel. You also have human flight. Now, human beings had been dreaming about being able to fly for centuries. Even Leonardo da Vinci had mock-ups of how to make helicopters, airplanes, etc. But it's in the early 20th century that that actually comes into being. And this is a huge deal. People are so excited about this. Now, as you can see, compared to the planes we have today, this is a bit more primitive in terms of flying technology. But this was very, very exciting. I mean, people could fly now. This was absolutely exciting. Pilots were seen as sort of the rock stars of their day. This was seen as incredible. And then you also have movies, moving pictures. Now, these were, of course, in this period, they were black and white, they were silent. They also would not have been very long. You wouldn't have had any hour and a half, 2-hour movies at this point. They would have been much shorter. But this was very exciting. Movies were cheap entertainment. Before this, the different social classes, the wealthy, the middle class, the working class, were very much separated in what kind of entertainment they partook in based on cost. I mean, the working class couldn't afford to go to the opera or to plays. But movies were cheap and everybody went. So this is really some of the first popular entertainment that is accessible to all classes. And this means that people are more and more partaking in the same pop culture. By the 1920s, you start to see the sort of creation of the movie stars we know them today. But it all starts back here. Now, all of these developments seem to lead people of the period to believe that these were all very good things. This showed that human progress was positively moving forward. There was this idea that progress was always good, always forward, never backward kind of an idea. World War I is going to call that idea into question of whether or not progress is always good. Now, there are many causes for World War I, and again, these are going to cause people to rethink this idea about progress. Now, while strides were being made in cinema, transportation, etc., there were also developments in this period that set the stage for the total destruction that came to characterize the First World War. There are many, many reasons why World War I happened, and we're going to look at a few. The first of which is industrialization. Now, industrialization of war was made possible by the Industrial Revolution that we talked about in week 1. Remember, industrialization means you can make products in a manufacturing plant, on an assembly line, much faster. So this means, and we talked about this with Empire, you are able to manufacture guns, ammunition, bombs much, much faster and in much higher quantities. And that helped these Europeans build their empires. But it also meant that by the turn of the 20th century, all the major industrialized nations had the same amount of a military arsenal. Now, one of the most important and iconic parts of World War I machinery is the Maxim machine gun, which is pictured on the right. And that's a Maxim, M-A-X-I-M. Now, the Maxim machine gun was finally kind of perfected by 1884 by an American. The American Army was not interested in buying it, so he went and he ended up finding a buyer in the British Army. Now, this was the first gun that was both single-barreled and fully automatic, and it could fire 500 rounds per minute. At the time, that was unprecedented. Now, the British Army decides to take this out and try it out in the Sudan. They had acquired the Sudan through that scramble for Africa we talked about, and the Sudanese didn't really like being controlled by the British, and they had rebelled. So the British Army takes the Maxim machine gun to the Sudan to put down this rebellion. Now, because of the Maxim machine gun, the British Army fired 500,000 bullets on the Sudanese, who did not have machine guns. They had rifles, but they did not have machine guns. They had nothing that could fire this incredibly fast. In the one day of fighting, 10,800 Sudanese died, 16,000 were wounded, and only 48 British were dead. Now, this is important because there are some takeaway messages that the British come away with. The British Army Command takes away from this the lesson that when you have all this fancy military technology, wars in the future are now going to be quick and you'd be able to win them easily. That's their takeaway lesson. Now, the Germans, the French, the US, everybody's watching what happens here. And these other countries come away with the same lesson, that we need to have all this machinery too for the same reason. But they failed to take something into account, something very, very important. They failed to account for what happens if you're fighting a country who has the exact same weaponry as you. They were assuming that the future wars would be fought in the colonies against groups of people that did not have the machine gun or the French 75, which is pictured on the left. This is a huge, huge error here in military strategic planning for the future wars to come. By 1914, the majority of Western European nations were industrialized, so they all had the same technology. One other thing to keep in mind here is that by 1914, Europe had not been involved in a continent-wide war since Napoleon 100 years before. And many historians have argued that this, coupled with the increase in military technology, played a major role in the outbreak of World War I. Now, the second major cause of the war is something known as the cult of the offensive. Because industrialization had dramatically changed the way military technology was produced, each major industrialized nation cultivated this cult of the offensive. Now, this cult of the offensive refers to the idea that each of these nations believed that, because of their enormous strides in military technology, that the face of battle had been irrevocably changed. And they believed that instead of long, drawn-out wars, that future wars would be lightning fast. Winners, they thought, would be decided by acting offensively rather than defensively. Because they believed this, each of these nations came up with a military strategy should they ever need it for future war. And these military plans capitalized on swift action and unhindered mobility. They really believed that one decisive battle would now be all it took to win a war. Now, many countries had these sort of cult of the offensive plans. We're not going to talk about all of them. I'm just going to point to a couple. Germany has the Schlieffen Plan. France has Plan 17. Russia had something called Plans A and G. But all of them focus on attacking the enemy first. That because these battles were going to be won fast, you couldn't wait around to go on the defensive. You had to be on the offense. The problem with that thinking is someone's always going to be on the defense, right? I mean, that's kind of the problem with this thinking. By 1914, each of the major combatant nations in World War I had battle plans that thus required them to go to war first. And that is a very big deal. That means there's so little time for diplomacy, so little time for discussing other options other than war. And that is significant to how World War I breaks out. Now here is a map. This is a map of both the Schlieffen Plan of the Germans and the French plan. So the Schlieffen Plan is noted here in the red dotted line. So the plan for the Germans was to wheel up through Belgium. This is a big deal because Belgium was neutral, so it wasn't supposed to be invaded. The German army would wheel up through Belgium, coming through the border between Belgium and France, which was not really protected, wheel down, ultimately taking the city of Paris, and that would end any war the Germans might fight with France. The Germans are very concerned because they think France is their most likely enemy, so that's why their battle plan focuses on France. Now, France is similarly worried about Germany. France and Germany had fought in the late 19th century the Franco-Prussian War. France had lost really embarrassingly. So there's a lot of old bitterness between these two nations. Now, France's plan is represented on the map with the blue arrows and the blue circles. The blue circles represent their forts along their mutual border with Germany. The French plan was to launch an invasion from those forts into Germany. Unlike the German plan, the French plan it's not as clear as it needed to be. It didn't state what their intent was. Are they trying to take over all of Germany? Are they just trying to get to Berlin? What's the point of this invasion? But what's going to happen when war breaks out, and we'll talk about this again in a minute, is that the French are at their forts along their border with Germany. The Germans are going to come in north of that, and that's going to create a whole slew of problems. Now, the third cause of World War I is empire, and that's one reason why we spent an entire lecture talking about European empires. 1914 was both the apex of European empire as well as the beginning of the end of European empires. World War I is going to destroy 3 empires, as we'll see, and will severely weaken the rest. World War I was definitely driven by the need to protect empire, but as I said, ironically, it will also be the thing that causes the end of so many of them. As we saw in our lecture about empire, various European empires were competing with each other, basically over who was best, who got the most territory, who had the most power. And by the outbreak of World War I, there was tremendous competition between the British and the Germans. Germany united as a nation in 1871. Before that, it had been a bunch of smaller principalities ruled by small-level princes and kings. But after it unites, Germany becomes an empire. They realize, much like Japan did, that if you wanted to be a part of the world as it was becoming, you had to have an empire. So that's why Germany hosted the Berlin Conference. That's why they go about trying to acquire empire. And they will start building up a navy that they are hoping will rival Britain's navy. They really kind of poke the bear here in terms of they irritate the British a great deal. Britain and Germany are very close to each other geographically, and this is very irritating to the British that they have the best navy in the world. How dare Germany come along and try to steal their thunder, basically. But they're not the only ones competing. I mean, all of these European nations, Russia, France, Italy even, they all want an empire, and they're all jockeying with each other for that. And I always like to joke that this is kind of like that scene in the first Avengers movie where all the Avengers are on that big fancy plane and they're in that room and they're basically fighting over who's better, who's cooler. And that's kind of this situation. So if that helps you, you can picture like Russia as the Hulk and Britain as Captain America, ironically, and France is Iron Man, if you want. But it's the same kind of thing. There's a jockeying over who's the best. And in this case, that is going to definitely lead to the war. As I said, this is going to be a war fought over protecting empire, keeping other people from having what you have or what you want. Now, the fourth cause is the European alliance system. Now, how these alliances get developed is incredibly complicated, so I'm going to try to distill it down to its essential parts. By 1914, you end up with the Triple Alliance, more commonly known as the Central Powers. These are not the Axis powers. Axis powers specifically refers to the Second World War, not World War I. So don't confuse them because they're not the same. So the Central Powers by the outbreak of the war consist of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Now they all come together. Germany, again, because it's becoming an empire, it's irritating the British, it's already irritated the French. They realize they don't have a lot of friends in Europe. And if they were to be attacked, they need help. So they ally with their neighbors to the south, Austria-Hungary, which is a pretty smart choice. Again, they are neighbors, they share a border, but also they share a Germanic culture, the same language, etc. Later, they'll bring in the Ottoman Empire, which at the time encompassed Turkey, much of what is now Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, etc. And they bring in the Ottoman Empire because the Ottomans also don't really have a ton of friends. But the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian leaders promised the Ottoman Empire a lot of positive inducements that get them to join their side. The Ottomans are also really concerned about Russia, as are the Germans. So these three are banding together over some shared concerns over the power of Russia and the power of France. This agreement means that should one of them be attacked, the other two will rise to the occasion and come to their defense. Now on the other side, you have the Triple Entente, more commonly called the Allies. And this is Britain, France, and Russia. They all get together because they're all worried about Germany. Britain doesn't like how Germany is challenging their navy. France is worried that Germany might try to come and invade them. And Russia also doesn't like. They feel like Germany is really throwing off the balance of power in Europe. Now, an important sort of seemingly smaller piece of this, but certainly important, is the country of Serbia. Now, Serbia is a small nation in the Balkans. So the Balkans are where Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Macedonia, etc. are. And Serbia has become an independent nation. Many of the other nations in the Balkans were controlled either by the Ottoman Empire or by Austria-Hungary. Serbia had become independent, very uncomfortable with Austria-Hungary, and so they ally with Russia. There's a shared culture there, Slavic language, and Russia says, we'll help you out. If you get attacked, we'll come to your rescue because we don't really like Austria-Hungary. Serbia kind of needs that bigger nation to back them up. They're worried that Austria-Hungary may try to take them over at some point. Tensions get even worse between everybody when Austria-Hungary takes over Bosnia, which is a neighbor of Serbia. Serbia believes that Bosnia should get to determine its own government and not just be gobbled up by an empire. Austria-Hungary believes that's not the case. And so tensions by 1914 are very, very high between Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that's going to be very important to the outbreak of the war. Now here is a map of Europe prior to World War I. So you can see down below Austria-Hungary, you can see Serbia there in purple. Again, you can see why this is scary to the Serbians because they share a border with Austria-Hungary. And at this point, Austria-Hungary is huge. You can see on the map. I mean, it takes over much of Eastern Europe. Now, why am I telling you all of this about Serbia? It's because of this. Now, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, a guy named Archduke Franz Ferdinand, went on sort of a goodwill tour to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. He went there because Austria-Hungary had acquired Bosnia. He wanted to try to win hearts and minds, win people over, convince them that, no, really, we're not that bad. We have your best interests at heart. That was his goal. Now, this had been a much publicized visit. Now, there was a group in Serbia known as the Black Hand. They were a secret organization. They were a nationalist organization that believed that not only should Serbia continue to be free, but that Bosnia should also be free. And one of the members of that group was the man on the right, Gavrilo Princip, who at the time was 19 years old. Now, he and an accomplice went to Sarajevo with the intention to assassinate the Archduke. Their goal here was to send a message that both Serbia and Bosnia would not take Austria-Hungary's incursion lying down, basically. Now, it's important to note that he and the Black Hand organized this without the knowledge of the Serbian government. This is not government orchestrated at all. Now, what happens is there are actually several assassination attempts. The first attempt, Gavrilo Princip's accomplice throws a bomb under the car that's carrying the Archduke and his wife Sophie. The bomb bounces and explodes in an alleyway, hurting no one. After this, the Archduke, people try to convince him to stop doing all of his schedule for the day. He refuses, tries to send his wife away. She says, wherever he goes, I will go. And so they stick together and they stick to the plan. Now, the Archduke thought that this was just a one-off incident. So he thought kind of the worst was over. After he has lunch with the mayor of Sarajevo, his driver of his car makes a wrong turn and has to turn around. Well, because these streets in Europe, and if you've ever been to Europe, you know how narrow some of these streets are. These streets were built centuries before cars. They weren't built to handle that kind of traffic. And so when this driver tries to turn around, it's like a 30-point turn. It takes him forever to turn around. And as he's turning around, who should be standing on the sidewalk but Gavrilo Princip? This is perhaps the greatest coincidence in human history. So Gavrilo Princip levels the gun into the car carrying the Archduke and his wife, fires several shots, killing both of them on the spot. He then tries to bite down on a cyanide capsule to commit suicide. There's not enough cyanide in the capsule, and if that's the case, if you ingest cyanide but not enough to kill you, it just makes you violently ill. So that's all that happened to him. He was tackled by people on the street and sent to prison. He was put on trial for this. He did express remorse that he had killed the Archduchess, but other than that, never expressed any sort of guilt or remorse. He actually dies in prison during the war of tuberculosis, which was incredibly common at the time. So you're probably asking yourself, okay, why does the assassination of this Archduke somehow lead to World War I? Well, what happens is the alliance system kicks in, as well as all those other factors. So remember that Serbia, right, these Gavrilo Princip and his accomplice were Serbian, even though they're acting in Bosnia. Austria-Hungary's mad, right? The heir to their throne has been killed, and they can't let that pass. They can't hold anyone in Bosnia responsible, so they look to Serbia, and they blame the Serbian government. And they say, this is your fault, you did this, even though the Serbian government didn't actually know about this. So Austria-Hungary basically issues a series of demands. It's called the Note, very ominously. They issue a series of demands to the Serbian government and say, you have to do all this stuff. Well, the Serbians agree to everything but one. And so Austria-Hungary says, that's it, you didn't agree to all our terms, we declare war. So Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Now, at this point, it could have just been a small-time war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. But who is Serbia's big friend? Russia. Russia has vowed that if anyone comes at Serbia, Russia's got their back. So once Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, Russia comes to Serbia's defense and declares war on Austria-Hungary. Now, even that might have been contained, but for the alliance system. Because who is Austria-Hungary's ally? Germany. And Germany had agreed that they would help Austria-Hungary should anyone declare war on them. So at this point, Germany ends the war. Well, once Germany ends the war and declares war on Russia, that pulls France in. Because remember, France has vowed to support Russia. Now, Britain will hold off a little while. Britain will hold off the longest. They will actually join once Germany enacts the Schlieffen Plan and invades Belgium, arguing that you can't just invade a neutral country, that's against international law. Now that means by August of 1914, all the major players are involved, and everybody is scrambling to get their armies to the front because, again, they believe it will only be one epic battle that's going to win this war. So everybody's mobilizing fast. And that's why this moves so quickly. There's no time for diplomacy. Now, since each of these major combatant nations believed in swift, mobilized, offensive warfare that would culminate in a single decisive battle, each of them believed that the war would be over by Christmas of 1914. Now, as you know, Germany planned to and did invade Belgium to gain access to France. And here again is that map if you need reference. Due to Belgian resistance and some unforeseen problems, it took the German army longer than planned to get to France. And this gave the French army adequate time to move their major forces from their forts, which are again in blue circles, to move those soldiers north to meet the German army as they came across the French and Belgian border. Now, this means that France almost immediately had to throw away their offensive battle plan. And the thing is, nobody had a plan B. Nobody had a backup, a what if we have to go on the defensive plan, which seems, again, like a huge oversight. Now, because it took the Germans longer to get through Belgium than expected, because the French were able to move to meet them, that means the German army never gets to Paris. They do get close, but they are eventually pushed back to northern France, closer to Belgium. What this means is, with the Battle of the Marne in September of 1914, we have stalemate. So very quickly, within a couple of weeks, everybody's offensive battle plans are thrown out the window. They don't work anymore. And everyone is going to spend the next 4 years of this war trying to figure out how to win it. So this is kind of epically poor planning in every way you could think about it. Now, at this point, the war grinds down into trench warfare. Now, trench warfare becomes iconic and very much connected to World War I. But this is not the first time soldiers have used trenches. I mean, trenches have been used in every war up to this point, certainly were used after it. But they become iconically World War I because so much of the war is spent in these trenches. In previous wars, you would dig a trench to keep yourself safe from fire, and then you would move on. World War I, these soldiers end up spending the better part of 4 years in the same trenches. Now, life in the trenches was not a picnic. It was dirty, muddy, it was very wet. It's very, very rainy in northern France and Belgium. Also, the water table is very high in these areas. And so what that means is, as you can see in the picture on the right, you only have to dig down not that far before you hit a great deal of water. So a lot of times these soldiers are standing in 2 feet of water every day, all day. And this leads to a condition called trench foot, which human skin is not supposed to be wet for that long. And so what happens is, if your skin gets that wet for that long, never getting to dry out, basically, it will, and this is rather gross, but it will start to peel away. It will basically rot and fall off. So a lot of soldiers during the war are evacuated to medical hospitals to treat trench foot. So there's a lot of focus during the war on, clean, fresh socks, fresh shoes, making sure you're drying out your feet so that this doesn't happen to you. Now, in addition to all of this, they also have to contend with a lot of rats and a lot of lice. The longer the war goes on and the more dead bodies there are unburied in, between the two trenches, the more and more rats are sort of flocked to the front, because rats, of course, will feed on corpses. The more and more rats you get, the more and more they carry lice. You see lots of soldier accounts talking about waking up from trying to catch some shut-eye in the trenches to a rat nibbling on them. Like, these rats got brave. So, very unpleasant. And then, of course, on top of all that, there's the threat of being shot. So, not a pleasant experience. Now, German trenches, one of which is pictured on the left, were by and large better than French trenches. Try to say that 10 times. French trenches. And the reason for that, as you can see, the German trench here has reinforced walls, it has floorboards. The reason for that is because the Germans had to retreat, they were able to claim the high ground when they dug in. So they were able to find areas where the water table wasn't quite so high, which certainly helped. The British and the French mostly have the low ground, which means they are definitely, literally, fighting an uphill battle. Now, not all trenches were as bad as the one on the right. I kind of gave you worst case scenario. Not all British and French trenches were that bad, but some of them definitely were. Now, here is a great view of what the trench system looked like, because it's very, very complicated. Now, if you have recently seen Wonder Woman, and I hope you all have, they do a very good job of portraying the trench system and no man's land. No man's land is the term used for the area between the two trenches, and that is referenced and shown in Wonder Woman as well. So on this map, you can see no man's land there towards the left. There would have been giant craters. And again, you saw this in the film as well, if you've seen it. Giant craters because of the artillery they were using. I mean, we're talking this artillery that they're using spits out, they're between like 1 and 2 tons. These are huge. So when they explode, they create these huge craters. The water table is very high. They fill with water. Oftentimes when soldiers try to cross, they get stuck in these. Sometimes they drown in the water. So if you were trying to go over, you would have to cross all of that while being fired upon by the opposing side. Then in front of the trenches, as you can see represented here, there are barbed wire fences. Now, barbed wire was actually invented here in the United States as a way to sort of carve out your piece of land out in the West, right? As white settlers began to settle the West. It's used to much more lethal purpose here in World War I. The goal of the barbed wire was to, if soldiers tried to get over, they would get stuck trying to get through the barbed wire, and you could shoot them, which is the picture you saw at the very first slide. Now, this is why all soldiers would have been equipped with wire cutters to try to cut through the barbed wire, but this was incredibly difficult to do. As you can see, the front line trench is dug very intentionally in a serpentine pattern. Now, the reason for that is very strategic. It's not because they had a little too much to drink and they didn't know how to do a straight line. It's because if you did your trench in a straight line, if the enemy got over into your trench, all they'd have to do was hop in and then fire right down the trench, and you'd hit everybody in range. In this serpentine pattern, that's impossible. There's too many corners. You can't take out as many people. So it's very intentional. Now, in the front line, you also have dugouts. These would have provided some protection. This is where you might be able to go to catch a little shut-eye, which arguably would have been very difficult because of all the noise of the bombardments that went on for days, 24 hours. Now, if you were in one of these dugouts and were hit by artillery, you would very likely be buried alive. They oftentimes were not deep enough or well built enough to really provide you that protection. Now, as you can see behind that, you have a support trench. That's where the blockhouse for the machine gunners would be. On the support trench, you would have a deeper dugout. The German ones were very well done and actually could sustain a direct hit by artillery. So that would definitely be a better case scenario. Behind that, you have the reserve trench. And then behind that, you have the location of the long-range artillery. That's where, the artillery is that's making those big craters in no man's land. Now, because everybody's panicking about how to end this war now that they don't know what they're doing, this leads to a whole slew of new kinds of war technology. Now, one of the first and most famous pieces of war technology is the use of gas. Gas was first used by the Germans against the British and the French in April of 1915. The Germans released chlorine from canisters, and they kind of tossed the canisters into no man's land on the hope that the wind would just carry it over to the other side. Now, I'm sure many of you are thinking to yourself, that sounds like a terrible idea, and you would be correct, because the wind is unpredictable, and it definitely oftentimes blew that very same chlorine gas back into the German lines. Now, the first time this is used, no one had ever used this before. There'd never been gas warfare before. So you see these accounts of British and French soldiers who survived it, and they said, we had no idea. It just looked like this rolling, sort of yellowish cloud. And of course they panic. They retreat very quickly backwards. Those that do breathe it in began coughing, rolling on the ground. It's just incredibly painful. Now, the Germans will later develop two other gases, mustard gas and phosgene gas, none of which are a good time, guaranteed. The British and the French will then begin developing these same gases, so eventually you have both sides using gas on each other. You can see in the picture there the different kinds of gas masks that they experimented with. At first they would just have you hold a handkerchief over your mouth, but that wasn't really effective. But you can see all the different iterations of different gas masks. Now, phosgene gas will kill you, but it won't have an immediate impact. So it almost gives you this really creepy day or so where you feel like you're fine. It takes a really long time to kill you, but you probably usually die about a day later. Both chlorine and phosgene gas cause death by asphyxiation. You suffocate. Mustard gas was the most deadly because it basically rots your body from the inside out. It could take you up to 5 weeks to die from mustard gas, and there was literally nothing anyone could do. It was rotting your body from the inside out. One thing I should also say is in terms of medical care, World War I is very fascinating because World War I ends up accelerating a lot of our medical knowledge because people are on the ground having to figure things out. But this is an era before any sort of antibiotics. They hadn't been invented yet. So a lot of soldiers in World War I actually die from things that are now very treatable, like gangrene and infections. But at the time, they combated them as best they could, but there just simply were no antibiotics. Not that antibiotics would have helped with mustard gas, but just that's a note. Now, if you did survive any of these gases, which some men did, you were generally scarred for life. Because they so much affected the lungs, a lot of them had serious lung problems, and many of them did not live past the 1920s due to what happened to them in the war. The war also saw the first use of flamethrowers. This was incredibly dangerous in World War I. I kind of morbidly joke in my World War I class that if you time traveled, don't go become a flamethrower in World War I. And that's because this was so dangerous. Flamethrowers were in their infancy. The technology was not great. And honestly, it was more dangerous to be the flamethrower than the person they were trying to throw the flame at. Because you had the gas in a tank attached to your back, it was very unstable. And oftentimes it exploded, killing the person wearing it. These are not really that helpful. They will be perfected and used to much more lethality in the Second World War in the Pacific Theater. Now, another improvement in technology motivated by World War I were those made to airplanes. Now, initially, planes were used in the war for reconnaissance missions, so they would try to fly over enemy lines and figure out where troops were gathering up and things like that. As the war went on, planes took on a more and more lethal purpose. In the beginning, pilots were not equipped to fight each other, although sometimes they would actually physically carry some small bombs and then drop them out the side. So these are not airplanes like World War II. This is not like World War II at all. We're talking you can only fly to a certain height because there's no pressurized cabin. So if you fly too high, you're going to pass out. This oftentimes meant that they were very easy targets for the artillery on the ground, so they had to be very careful. Now, for a while, pilots would carry, and this is one of my favorite things, it's so interesting to me. Initially, pilots, because they weren't outfitted with any sort of guns, they would take a pistol with them, and say a British pilot and a German pilot would fly at each other, kind of like a really, really scary game of chicken. They'd fly at each other and they would pull out their pistols and they'd fire at each other, basically like a duel in the air. This was very ineffective, as you might guess. They also tried to carry like grenades with them for the same purpose. Some of them even said that they would throw bricks at each other. It just seems so wild to me that this is a very modern war, and yet you have soldiers throwing bricks at each other. It's a little bit comical. Now, by 1915, planes were now outfitted with machine guns that better allowed pilots to fight each other in the sky. Now, planes in World War I do not in any way determine the outcome of the war, but they do demonstrate the remarkable strides this technology made during the war. And it also signifies this idea that human beings were kind of like, oh, we made this really amazing thing where we can fly. How can we use it to kill people? It's kind of, again, a little bit comical. Now, it was extremely dangerous to be a pilot in World War I. Pilots were often regarded as celebrities, as sort of heroes of the sky. Two planes facing off in the sky seemed to represent sort of a last gasp of an honorable seeming form of warfare rather than what was going on the ground. Now, pictured here is the British Royal Aircraft Factory SF-5A. Now, this picture is from the Museum of Flight in Seattle. If you've never been, go. It is so phenomenal. They have a huge World War I display, huge World War II. They have a space shuttle. It's super cool. Now, this plane was really the best Allied fighter plane of World War I. It was fast, strong, easy to fly, a little difficult to land. And many of Britain's flying aces flew this plane in particular. Now, when I say it was easy to fly, what I mean is that a lot of these different planes, because they were still in their infancy, they were all made wildly different. So it's not like you could fly one and know how to fly another. So a lot of the Allied pilots chose this one because it was so easy to learn to fly. Now, to be a flying ace, you had to have 5 confirmed kills. The top British flying ace had 73 before he himself was shot down. And I should note, very few of these pilots survived the war. Now, the very famous Red Baron, the German pilot whose real name was Manfred von Richthofen, had 80 confirmed kills before he was shot down. And here's his plane, the Albatros DVA, which is also at the Museum of Flight in Seattle. Now, we're not going to talk about all the battles of World War I. Frankly, we would be here forever. But we are going to talk about 2 to show you what this war looked like. The first one we're going to talk about is the Battle of Verdun. Now, the Battle of Verdun lasted from February of 1916 until December of 1916. This battle was so long and so big that 75% of the French army fought at it. Now, in early 1916, the city of Verdun in France was a fortified city surrounded by many forts. Now, in early 1916, there were only really a skeleton crew of soldiers there. Most of them were north fighting the Germans. Now, the French command did not believe that the Germans would attack Verdun, and thus why they had allowed so many soldiers to move north. Unfortunately, the German High Command did intend to attack and moved to do so in February. Now the plan here, the German plan, was to bleed France white. So the plan here is not to win. The plan is to force France to endure such heavy losses that they will give up. I mean, in many ways, it's sort of a battle of attrition here. Now, it took the Germans only 4 days to take the first major fort. But despite this, the French dug in and refused to retreat. They rallied around the phrase "un pas ne passe," and forgive my French is very woeful, but that means they shall not pass. And I always kind of like to picture Gandalf at this point, they shall not pass. Because the French really do dig in, and they do not allow the Germans to take anything more. By October of 1916, the French army had painstakingly retaken all the original forts that had been taken from them. Now, this battle, over by December 1916, is disastrous. 400,000 German soldiers are dead and wounded, 650,000 French, and that's all for 5 miles of territory that they were fighting over, that the French ended up taking back anyways. And herein lies the problem of the German command's strategy. How do you bleed France white without bleeding yourself as well? Which, as you can see, they obviously did. And this is very characteristic of World War I. Both sides incurring huge losses. Over 1 million soldiers are dead and wounded by the end of 1916. That is so important. After Verdun, the French army will be a shadow of its former self. And understandably, if you've lost well over 500,000 soldiers one way or the other, that's going to create some problems. Now, one thing I should also mention, one question I always get is, why did more people die, why did more soldiers die, I should say, in World War I than World War II? And the reason for that is because of metal technology at the time. Most men were not killed by bullets. Most were killed by artillery shell fire. Crude iron in the shells would shatter into these huge, ragged chunks that were usually too large for human beings to lift. So that meant, even if you're standing next to where it hit, a distance from it, you oftentimes got hit with the shrapnel. And shrapnel in this case is huge, several tons in and of itself. Also, you have the importance of the lack of antibiotics, that even if you did incur an injury like losing your arm or your leg, you might very well die from gangrene. So that combination of metallurgy techniques of the time as well as the lack of antibiotics led to higher soldier death rates. By the Second World War, metallurgy had advanced to the point that shells burst into smaller fragments, which meant that more men actually survived being hit by shrapnel in World War II. Here's a map of the fighting at Verdun. So the solid black line towards the top of the image is the German front line when they began the battle in February. The dotted line is as far as they ever get, and then you can see the little forts there. And there's this quote here from a French soldier who survived, who said, "What a bloodbath, what horrid images, what a slaughter. I just cannot find the words to express my feelings. Hell cannot be this dreadful." And if you're interested in French history, Verdun is very, very important in the long run. Verdun is such a bloodbath for the French. It is definitely part of the reason why they have a certain experience during the interwar period, and it definitely impacts their approach to the Second World War. But we'll talk about that more when we get to World War II. Now, one other major development of the war was women moving into the workforce in a much higher number than they had ever done before. Now, because you have millions of men being drafted into these various armies, these various countries needed people to pick up and do the work, right? Work in the factories, make the shells, keep the farming going. And women, up to this point, were really an untapped resource. Now, while some women did work prior to the war, it typically wasn't in this sort of way or in these high of numbers. Now, the kinds of jobs that women did were very much determined by which social class they were in. Middle to upper class women oftentimes became nurses or worked in charities to raise money for disabled soldiers and things like that. Working class women, as we'll see, generally worked in factories. They are the ones making the bombs, making the guns, things like that. Now, this is the first time really in history that the boundary between civilian and combatant began to break down. Now, that's not to say that in every previous war civilians were sort of a protected group. That's not true at all. I mean, just ask the people who were attacked by the Mongols or the Vikings. But this is the first time where we start to see civilians regarded as a legitimate target of warfare in a way they really hadn't been before this. And this will be expanded on when we talk about World War II. Now, to give you an idea of the numbers here, just in munitions factories alone, so factories that made war weaponry, in Britain, almost 1 million women went to work in the munitions factories alone. 1.3 million went into the workforce in a different way. So that means working at, shops, government jobs. Actually, in Britain, you actually have the creation during World War I of the first female police officers. So you have women going to work in whole new ways. In Germany, 2.3 million women entered the workforce. And again, that's huge. These are in many cases, women who had not worked before. Now, women's roles in the war were not just restricted to factories. They also worked in medicine, and they are actually incredibly important. You have women becoming nurses in far higher numbers. Women had only been recognized nursing had only been really recognized as a profession starting in the late 1800s. So this is still very new. There were still a lot of parents who didn't want their daughters becoming nurses. So this was still very hard. And again, these would have been more middle-class women to upper-class women. You also had women becoming ambulance drivers. The picture on the bottom left is of two women named Elsie and Mary who bought themselves an ambulance and went to the front and kind of just on their own would help get soldiers from the front line back to the hospital to be treated. And they actually saved a lot of people's lives through their work. On the bottom right is a doctor who served in the war, Dr. Elsie Inglis, who was Scottish, and she actually crowdfunded the money to build a hospital. It was known as the Scottish Women's Hospital in Serbia to treat people who were affected by the war. The British government wouldn't give her any money because she was a woman, but in sort of a typical Scottish fashion, she said, "To hell with you, I'll do it on my own." And she did. And she ended up building many more hospitals across the war front, which also helped save people's lives. Interestingly, she only employed women. So at these hospitals, all the staff, all the nurses, all the doctors were women, which is also pretty impressive for this particular time frame. She ended up saving so many people's lives in Serbia from a cholera outbreak that the Serbians still to this day love her. They put up a statue to her. At the time, she was considered to be the sort of guardian angel for the Serbian people. Now, women also serve the war effort in combat. You have women who become spies for both sides. Very famously, you have Mata Hari, but you also have many other female spies as well. But you do have several cases of women serving as soldiers. So on the bottom right, you have Flora Sands, who was British, who served in the Serbian army, and I believe she ended the war at the rank of captain. You also have on the top here, in the top picture on the right side, is a woman named Yashka, also known as Maria Bachkareva, who was Russian, who served at the front and actually was given special permission to form an all-women's battalion. They're known as the Battalion of Death. And as I always like to say, the Russians really know how to name stuff. And we'll follow up on that when we talk about World War II. But these are examples of different, very non-traditional roles that women served in the war that oftentimes we don't talk about, but they are incredibly important, as well as being very interesting. Now, we've talked a lot about empires. Here they are again. Because, and don't feel like you have to write down all these numbers. I know that's a lot, but I wanted you to see just how many people. Because France and Britain, etc., had colonies, and they needed a lot of soldiers for the war, they recruited in their colonies for the war effort. So the French recruit 200,000 Algerians, Moroccans, and Tunisians. Many Indians serve within the British Army. Overall, 1 million people from Africa serve, an entire continent. 1 million Australians, New Zealanders, and Canadians, who are all connected through the British Empire. 50,000 Vietnamese and 13,000 Chinese from what is now Vietnam were brought to France to work in the munitions factories. So this is very much a world war in this sense, but it also is a global war in the sense that it pulls in people from across the globe. People in this case who really didn't feel like they had any real stake in this war at all, right? They didn't feel like it was their war. But this is very important in the long run, because what it means is that these soldiers from across the colonies were receiving military training, but they were also witnessing firsthand the carnage Europeans were committing against each other. And this seemed to imply to them that, the Europeans have been telling us they're more civilized than us and superior to us, but would a group of people who are really that sophisticated and superior do this to each other? So it really breaks down all that civilizing mission, scientific racism ideology that the Europeans had been trying to sell to the people in their colonies. And this is the beginning of the breakdown of imperial power for Britain and France, even though it's going to take quite a few decades. Now the war, as I said, was also fought globally. Now the war is not just fought in Europe, it's fought in many places. Because the major powers were all empires, this meant that they drew not just their soldiers from their colonies, but that they fought in their colonies too. There were military campaigns in Southwest Africa, East Africa, Palestine, Iraq, Turkey, all over these colonies. Now, in terms of the participation in Africa, the Great War really complicated the situation of many African nations who had begun to agitate for independence. The colonial ties that bound African colonies to European powers kind of ensured that many people in Africa would end up in the war. European states transmitted their animosities and military conflicts to African soil and drew on their colonies for support. They forced many African men in particular into military service. So that's what I mean by military service made compulsory. That they were forced to join the various British, French, German armies. Now, every African nation took sides in the war except for Ethiopia and Liberia, which we talked about before. They were not colonies, so they didn't have to choose a side. Although Germany was a latecomer to the empire game, they had carved out some African colonies in Togo, Cameroon, Southwest Africa, and East Africa. So one of the most immediate outcomes of that was that the Allies invaded those colonies, thus bringing the war to Africa itself. Now, as I said, more than 1 million African soldiers participated directly in the war, but many millions more Africans saw what was happening in the war. The colonial powers encouraged their African subjects in uniform to kill the enemy, who was European and white, and who up till now, whose life had been considered sort of above reproach. So again, this is a breakdown of that racial hierarchy that Europeans had been sort of spewing, for lack of a better word, in Africa for several decades. Now, in the long run, this is going to enable more rebellion, more protest, as many people across the continent of Africa will say, we didn't want to fight this war. You brought this war to us. You've conquered our nation. You've not allowed us our freedom. And this leads to a lot of deep-seated anger over the fact that many African men were forced to serve. And that's going to simmer for several decades and eventually explode into African nationalism and African nations becoming independent. Now, we need to spend a minute talking about American entry into the war. Now, the United States was not in the war for very long. President Woodrow Wilson had really tried to avoid getting the United States involved in World War I. Many Americans saw this as a European war that had nothing to do with them. At this point, the United States was very isolationist, very uninterested in sort of engaging in world events on this scale. But what begins to change that is the Germans using unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic Ocean, which ended up sinking quite a few American ships. You have the sinking of the Lusitania, which was not an American ship. There were some Americans on board, but by and large, the majority of people on that ship were from other countries. They also were sinking many merchant ships that were American ships, and this is getting very irritating to the United States. But what will really sort of kick this over the edge is something known as the Zimmermann telegram. Now, the Zimmermann telegram was sent by Germany, the German government, to the German ambassador in Mexico City. And it basically said, hey, do you think you can get the Mexican government to invade the United States? We don't want the United States getting involved in the war on the side of the Allies. Therefore, if you distract them, then maybe they won't join and we won't have to worry about that. Well, what happens is the British uncover this. And they really debate whether or not to tell the United States, because if they let this slip, then the Germans will know that the British have cracked their code. So through a series of back channels, the British tell the US government about this telegram. The German ambassador in Mexico City never takes this to the Mexican government because he's like, this is a crazy idea that will never work. Not to mention the fact that at this point, Mexico was also having a lot of its own internal problems and could not have afforded this sort of war waging anyways. But once this news gets to the United States government, people are angry, it gets leaked to the press, everybody knows about it. The picture on the left is a picture of the telegram itself, sent in code. And then the picture on the right, that map, is what the Germans promised that they would give Mexico back. So they said, if Mexico does this, when we win the war, we'll give you back these states, Texas, etc., that had been lost, that Mexico had lost in the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, which was a pretty big thing to promise. But again, Mexico never had any intention of doing this. But this really pisses off the US government, the American people, that Germany would try to do this. So President Wilson goes to Congress, asks for a declaration of war, which they give him. The first American troops arrived in Europe in June 1917, although not in very high numbers. At this point, the US Army was one of the smallest armies in the world. So they didn't really have a lot of soldiers. So it's going to take a while for the US to institute the draft and to get enough trained soldiers to send to help. Now, American troops do provide helpful reinforcements, which certainly took some pressure off the British and the French, but the US does not single-handedly win this war in any way, shape, or form. What will really end the war is what's going on the German home front. Now, Germany, their home front is collapsing by the last 2 years of the war. Basically, what happens is Germany is stuck in terms of food production. Germany had largely imported a lot of their food, but the more and more they're fighting They're also fighting the Russians in the east, the rest of the Allies on the west. They are really boxed in. The British Navy has got the German Navy boxed in, so they can't even bring in food supplies that way. And what happens from 1916 to 1918 is you see a lot of starvation situation. You have rationing. People are waiting in lines like this, and a lot of times when you get to the head of the line, there's absolutely no food. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was one of the coldest winters in German history, and it is called the turnip winter because all anybody had to eat were turnips, which I don't know if you've ever eaten a turnip, but they are really not the most exciting vegetable. They didn't have wheat, and they tried making food out of all sorts of things. They tried to substitute a lot of things. They didn't have coffee anymore. They tried to make a substitute coffee out of chicory bark, which sounds pretty gross. I've never tried it, but it does not sound good. And so people are starving to death back home in Germany. This means black market activity just goes through the roof as people manage to get a hold of things and can charge whatever they want. It's an incredibly bad situation. What this means is that, and this is true throughout history, if people are starving, they're very unhappy. And this tends to lead to revolution, which is what happened in Germany. The German Revolution was probably one of the least bloody revolutions in human history. Everybody is tired, they're hungry, and they're mad at the Kaiser, pictured here, Kaiser Wilhelm II, who's the leader of Germany. And the German Revolution forces him to abdicate. No one sticks up for him. No one says, hey, bring him back. That's how fed up the German people are. In truth, he was not a great ruler or really a great guy, but that's a story for a different day. Now, this revolution leads to a democratic government. The first time in German history, they're going to try out democracy. Now, unfortunately for the new democracy, they inherit this very unwinnable war, and they decide the best decision is to get out. So they sue for peace with the Allies to prevent Germany from falling further apart. Now, we'll see, this will come in again when we talk about the Nazis, because they're going to use this to their benefit in later decades. So the new German democracy is forced to pick up the pieces, sue for peace, after the Kaiser and military leaders made a huge mess of things. And in the end, the Nazis will blame them for this. This leads to the armistice, that's a ceasefire, on November 11th, 1918. So the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Europeans still call this Armistice Day or sometimes Remembrance Day. In the United States, we know it as Veterans Day. Now, at the end of the war, the armistice is just a ceasefire. It doesn't actually, it's on treaty, it doesn't actually hammer out the details of what happens. So everybody meets in Paris in 1919 to discuss what this will mean for the future. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details. It's at the Paris Peace Conference that the Allies formed the League of Nations, which is the forerunner of the United Nations. It was created as an international body for trying to find more peaceful diplomatic solutions to conflict so that they wouldn't fight another war like this. It is in Paris that they also assign the guilt of the war to Germany. Now, this is going to be a major problem for Germany in the interwar years and will, as we'll see, be one of the reasons that Hitler gains power. Now, the League of Nations sounded very promising to people around the world who were governed by a European empire. The League of Nations promised self-determination for all peoples, which many people took to mean that they would have and should have the ability to determine their own national futures rather than being governed by a European power. Now, some nations do get independence, like Hungary and Czechoslovakia, but many did not. This is sort of a moment of hope, and then that hope is dashed. Now here is a map of post-war Europe. So you can see Austria-Hungary, that empire does not make it out. It's carved up into the countries of Austria, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, etc. Also, the Ottoman Empire does not make it out. It is also carved up Turkey, Syria, Iraq, etc. Now here is another map just to give you more of an idea of how the Ottoman Empire is carved up. So as you can see, Turkey does become its own nation, but the Allies carve up the Middle East in a way that we're actually still dealing with the ramifications of today. Syria comes under the control of France. Iraq is under the control of the British, as is Palestine. The French have Lebanon. And again, a lot of the ramifications in the Middle East of this are still evident today, but that is definitely a topic for a different class and a much longer discussion, certainly. Now, there are many humongous impacts of World War I. We're going to talk about two here. The first is that, yes, the British and French empires remained intact, but they were severely weakened financially. They basically went bankrupt fighting this war. Empires had helped cause the war, and even though these two were not completely destroyed, they took a heavy hit. And as I said before, this is really the beginning of their end as empires. 3 empires did not survive the war: Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman, and the Russian Empire. Now we'll talk about Russia more in our next lecture. And as I said, this is the beginning of the end of European empires. It not only trained men of the colonies militarily, which they will later use against European empires, but it also shows that the supposedly superior Western nations had gone to war for what seemed like no real reason. Now, many people would come to see the war as a fruitless one, and as a result, pacifism became a popular political platform. The United States, though only enduring the war for less than a year, really, chose isolationism to abstain from interaction with the problems of Europe for the next 20 years. World War I is the main reason why the United States took so long to enter World War II. It is also why most of Europe will placate Hitler to avoid another war. That's how disastrous this war is to people at the time. World War I was so devastating that many people could not bear the idea of going through a similar war again, and within only a generation. Now, the total casualties of the war. I want you to have some idea of the human damage this war caused. 9 to 10 million military deaths. That is as if the populations of the states of Washington and Oregon ceased to exist in a 4-year period of time. On top of that, 6 to 7 million civilians died. Over 21 million people were wounded. And many of those woundings are, double, triple amputees. I mean, these are serious, serious war wounds. Of people born between 1892 and 1895, so between 19 and 22 at the start of the war, 33% of them did not survive the war. That's huge. This is why this is known as the lost generation, because so many of them died or were irrevocably wounded. And of course, as we now know, a lot of them came home with what we would now call PTSD, that at the time they didn't really understand and they didn't know how to treat. I mean, we're still trying to figure out how to help people with PTSD. So even those who returned did not return as the same people that they once were. Now, what I want you to do, now that we're at the end of this very long lecture, is I want you to YouTube or however you listen to music, a song by the band the Dropkick Murphys called The Green Fields of France. Now this song was written in the 1970s. It's been performed by a lot of different people. This is my personal favorite, but there are many others. Joss Stone did a version. I think Bob Dylan has a version. But the Dropkick Murphys one I think is quite well done. And it's about World War I. So when you're listening to it, think about the tone of the song, the message. What does it say about World War I? How does the singer view the young man's sacrifice in the song? And think about why the band might have chosen this. This came out on their 2005 album. What was happening in 2005 in the world that might have provoked the Dropkick Murphys to choose this song? Now, I will put a link in the announcement to a video of this. They never released an official video of it, but some fan put together one that I think is pretty good. You're obviously welcome to find your own version of it, but I will put a link to that in the announcement so you can just easily click that. You will need to discuss this as part of your post, so make sure you pay due attention to these questions. All right, that does it for this long lecture. In our next lecture, we will talk about the Russian experience of the war and how that led to the Russian Revolution and ultimately the first communist state.